Decline of the Mughal Empire. One view. Aurangzeb's divisive policies like religious policies, which alienated the majority Hindu subject population. Other view. Roots of decline lay in institutions and systems intrinsic to Mughal administration rather than in personalities or specific policies. Early historians like Sir J. N. Sarkar, 1932 to 50, believed that it was a crisis of personality. Weak emperors and incompetent commanders were responsible for fall of empire. But others like T.G.P. Spear in 1973 remarked that no dearth of able personalities in 18th century India like Sayyid brothers Nizam ul Mulk, Abdus Samad Khan, Zakaria Khan, Sadat Khan, Safdar Jung, Murshid Kuli Khan, Savai Jai Singh, Satish Chandra defined the Jagirdari crisis. The unusual increase in the number of Mansabdars at a time when the area to be distributed as Jagir or Paibaki remained stagnant or even declined. Revenue collection, particularly in South, fell far short of the estimated income, diminishing the real income of the Jagirdars in disturbed areas. Also, there was a continuous price rise since the late 17th century as the supply of luxury goods flowed towards the European markets, putting the Mughal aristocracy in further distress. As too many Mansabdars were now chasing too few Jagirs, many of them had to remain Jagirless for years. And even when a Jagir was assigned, there was no guarantee that they would not be transferred within a short period. The entire aristocracy suffered from a tremendous sense of personal insecurity. This Jagir crisis was not, however, a new phenomenon, as there had always been gaps between collection of revenue and the last years of Aurangzeb, mainly because of the Deccan Wars. There was now a rise in the number of Mansabdars, and the political turmoil made the collection of revenue a more difficult task. J. F. Richards in 1975 has argued that the problem was to some extent artificial and due to wrong policies of Aurangzeb, who was constantly expanding the size of the royal land or Khalisa. There was 23% increase in income after conquest of Bijapur and Golconda. So he went to finance the Deccan campaign, and the new land was incorporated into Royal Khalisa land. Its revenue to the salary of officers. An opportunity to solve Jagirdari crisis was lost, and thus, according to Richards, it was artificial. Richards shown that revenue collections in the Deccan were gradually falling, while Satish Chandra argues that Deccan was always a deficit area. Irfan Habib has shown that Mughal land revenue system rested on a compromise. The peasant was left with sufficient provisions for subsistence, while the surplus, as far as possible, was extracted by the state in the form of land revenue. In the Deccan, towards the last years of Bahadur Shah's reign, all the zamindars, but both primary and intermediary, turned against the Mughal state with the active support of the hard-pressed peasantry. One major reason for the open defiance of the local landlords might have been the increasing oppression of the Jagirdars. The earlier emperors tried to keep them in check through a system of rotation. Irfan Habib in 1963 has argued that because of this Mughal system and by taking advantage of it, the Jagirdars oppressed the peasantry. As they were frequently transferred, they did not develop any attachment or any long term interest in the estate and tried to extract as much as possible during their short tenures without any consideration for the peasants. Their natural oppressive propensities remained within certain limits only because of constant imperial supervision. But this supervisory system totally collapsed in the 18th century. The nobles who could resist or defy transfer developed local power bases and by using that tried to extract as much as possible. This trend was quite visible in Golconda after its subjugation. To some historians, poverty and economic pressure do not seem to be a wholly adequate explanation for these rebellions and the eventual decline of the Mughal state, since there had been significant regional variations in the local economies. Recent revisionist literature wants us to move away from this centrist view and to look at the situation from a different perspective, the perspective of periphery. The Mughal decline, according to this new history, is the result of the rise of new groups into economic and political power and the inability of a distant and weakened center to control them any longer. Regions like Muradabad, Bareilly, Awadh, Bengal were rich in the 18th century, but the Mughals could not appropriate this surplus, and this accumulated in the hands of local zamindars. Taking advantage of a weakening central control, they now found it more convenient to repudiate their allegiance to a centralized imperial power and assert their autonomy, while still maintaining the cultural and ideological framework of the Mughal state. There were corporate groups and social classes who enjoyed, despite a supposedly obtrusive central authority, various kinds of rights that constituted, in C.A. Bailey's terminology, their portfolio capital, which they could invest to reap huge profits. According to this school of history, throughout the Mughal period, there had been a constant process of conciliation and adjustment between the central power and the regional elite. Mughal sovereignty, as Andre Wink has argued, rested on a balancing system of continually shifting rivalries and alliances. So, as Muzaffar Alam sums up the situation around this time, because of decentralization and commercialization, a group of upstarts had come to monopolize the resources of the empire at the exclusion of the hereditary Mughal nobility or the Khanzads. These upstarts were the new regional power elite who rose to prominence in the provinces and successfully contested the centralizing tendency of the Mughal state. These groups included the Jagirdars, who defied transfer and thus became local rulers, and the revenue farmers or the new entrepreneurs in revenue, who combined military power with expertise in managing cash local trade. Consistent economic growth and prosperity, rather than poverty and crisis, thus provided the context of the local political turmoil. It is difficult to arrive at a convenient middle ground between the conventional and revisionist histories, nor is it easy to dismiss either of them. The revisionist history has been taken to task for understanding the cohesiveness of the Mughal Empire and for ignoring the contemporary Muslims' concepts of centralized sovereignty. These critics, on the other hand, have been assailed for clinging on to a mindset that is accustomed to look at the Mughal Empire only as a centralized structure. If there is any shared ground at all, as Athar Ali admits in his critique of the revisionist historiography, it is in the common recognition of the fact that the zamindars or the intermediary classes constituted a centrifugal force in the Mughal structure. We may, however, conclude that the idea of decline is perhaps an inadequate theme for understanding the 18th century in the Indian history. The Mughal system continued even long after the de facto demise of the Mughal Empire, which was followed by the emergence of a number of regional powers. The 18th century in Indian history is not a dark age, nor as a age, not as a nor an age of overall decline. The decline of one pan-Indian empire was followed by the rise of another, the intervening period between being dominated by a variety of powerful regional states. This century should therefore be considered, as Satish Chandra has argued, as a distinct chronological whole.